Hey, this is Kevin again, and today is part 2 of our walkthrough of the graphical user interface of the FS S5500-48T6SP-R. Let's do it. Last time we went through device status, basic config, port config, and today we're going to start with layer 2 config. The very first menu under layer 2 config is your VLAN config. Makes sense. Very easy to add VLANs to your switch. I've just added a few here as an example. You can, once you've added a VLAN, you can go back and edit it. For example, I've given VLAN 10 the name inside wired. Let's say VLAN 40 was for your security cameras. You can come back over here and click edit and change the VLAN, change the name to be IP cameras, for example, and then go down and hit apply. And it says it may interrupt traffic. You say okay. And notice it made that change immediately. If you need to save the configuration, typically it will pop up and say you need to save all. I'll go ahead and do that just to say we did. And configuration has been saved. And so now you can see VLAN 40 has the name IP cameras. It'll be a little bit easier to keep up with all your VLANs that way. And so then you have a VLAN batch config, which is when you're first setting up a switch, this is a time saver. For example, we've already created VLAN 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50. Let's say we wanted to create VLAN 100, 101, 102, etc. You can separate those with commas, or you could say something like VLAN 150 through 157, and we'll hit apply. Your VLANs, which will be very important, I'm sure, for you when you're initially configuring a switch, especially a layer 3 switch like this. Probably have a large number of VLANs. There's a section for interface VLAN attribute config, and you can see on a particular interface, like this is interface 1, the primary VLAN, that's the untagged VLAN, the mode of the port, whether it's access or trunk, the allowed VLANs, etc. This is very helpful. Basically, you can go through here and configure each of your ports and give the VLAN allowed range and the untagged port. Pretty straightforward. It's nice to be able to create all this and set it up in the graphical interface. So that rounds out the VLAN config section. The next section we have GVRP. You can either enable or disable that. You'll need to initially do that before you can go over and enable or disable that at the port level. We have spanning tree protocol config. You'll notice at a glance the current priority, forwarding delay, other things. You see what protocol type that's currently being used. The big thing to remember here is if you have a variety of different brands of switches on your network, make sure they're all using the same protocol type for spanning tree, or you may have some issues. A lot of people do use the rapid spanning tree protocol. As far as priority goes, the lower the number, the more of a priority it has. Keep that in mind if this is going to be maybe a core switch for you, because after all, this is a full layer 3 switch. You want to set a very low priority to make this the root switch, if you will, the root device. And there's some loop guards and some other things available there. And once you basically configure spanning tree to your liking, you have the port configuration. You can either disable or enable spanning tree on ports. This can be very useful if you have some aggregate ports, or for example, if you have an isolated VLAN that you know will not cause a loop, you may want to go in and disable spanning tree on those interfaces so traffic will flow. That particularly, I know in a use case, a real world scenario, maybe if you have an iSCSI network, so there's additional connections between two switches, and you don't want spanning tree disabling the unused or disabling one of those interfaces. You want traffic to flow on those. It is an isolated VLAN, there's no routing taking place, then you would want to disable spanning tree for those interfaces. We have IGMP Snooping. Several options you can set up here, either transfer unknown or discard unknown. You can add snooping to different interfaces here, VLAN IDs, all that can be set up here. multicast, list, all those kind of things. And by the way, this all does have to do with kind of multicast traffic. This can help keep the noise of that down, especially if you have large VLANs and a lot of devices. You know, obviously multicast traffic can get a little burdensome, so that can be helpful. You have your basic ARP. If you go in here and you can add an IP address and lock that to a MAC address and an interface VLAN. And you may be wondering about, can you see the ARP table in the graphical interface of the switch? If you recall from the first video that we created underneath the device status back at the top, if you go to MAC address table, you can see some useful information, but this is not exactly the same as an ARP table. I have been informed by FS that they're going to, in a future firmware update, try to include a full ARP table in the graphical interface that will show the interface, the MAC address, and the IP address of the device, which can be very helpful when you're trying to track down a device on your network. So back to layer 2 config, back to basic ARP. Again, you can kind of link that up, which can be helpful if you have a you want to make sure a certain device always gets the same IP address. We'll look at some more options when we get to DHCP that could also be useful there, that may be able to get you this to the same place. We have static MAC config. Again, you can set a static MAC address, VLAN ID, and assign that to a certain interface on your ports. We have LLDP configuration. You can set this up on a per interface once it's enabled. Right now that protocol is closed. You can open that and you can go and set that up if you'd like to. You have DDM config. It's enabled by default. Now we come to port channel. This is a very useful feature of the switch. It's nice. It can be set up in the graphical interface. This allows you to create aggregate groups of your network interfaces. Let's give a scenario. You have a server and it has two 1 gig interfaces. Maybe it's also a NAS, and you want to be able to aggregate or team those two 1 gig interfaces from your NAS to the switch to give you that resiliency if one link happens to die or fail, and also can increase your bandwidth. So you can create port aggregation groups here. So you can basically just add that, select your, choose your aggregate group here. Got a lot to choose from. It actually has a very long list, which is very nice. Sometimes switches are very limited on the number of aggregate groups you can have. Then you select the ports that you would like to be in that group. Nice to have this in the graphical interface. Normally command line saves you time, but in this case it may be easier, or at least a lot more straightforward to set this up in the graphical interface. Yeah, port channel global load balancing settings also. You have ring protection. It's oftentimes needed that you, in essence, purposely create a loop on your network, if you will, in order to have that resiliency. So if any link along the path dies, you still have that connectivity. And so you can create some ring protection here. And you have a ring ID, node type, etc. Again, you can set up multiple ring protection, different things there. BackupLink Config, this can be very helpful. You can actually set up if a particular link or interface goes down, it can basically go to that backup link, which is kind of neat. Kind of some of these advanced features. Again, this is a full layer 3 switch, so you're going to get a lot of features, even though this is in the layer 2 configuration. You have your standard DHCP snooping to make sure if you enable this, you can lock down your DHCP to ensure that devices are not going to, connect to and pull an IP address from a rogue DHCP server. So you can set up your DHCP snooping settings here under this menu. I'll just kind of run through the tabs there so you can take a look at this. You can always pause the video at any time to take a closer look at the options underneath each menu. You have your private VLAN configuration. This could be helpful if you need to isolate a section of the switch, maybe for a sandboxed environment, for a test environment. You can in essence, create a separate trunk port and different access ports that are completely isolated from the rest of the switch. Would not be part of the routing capability of the switch, even if you have routing enabled. So you can create a private VLAN list and then add the ports that you want to those private VLANs. Of course, you have your MTU config. This is your packet size, and you can set up jumbo frames. You can set up all the way to 9,216 on your MTU. And then we have PDP config, and you can, again, open or close that protocol. And this has, to a certain degree, to do with your wireless and wired connectivity and the way that those packets travel back and forth. And so you do have the ability to set that up. So that rounds out the layer 2 config section of this FS layer 3 switch. Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll go through the layer 3 config. Hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you found it helpful. To make sure, if you want to see future videos of not only this switch, but other FS switches and other technology in general, make sure to subscribe to our channel. If you click the bell, you'll be notified every time a new video goes out. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you later.